Let's rewind to the early 2000s for a minute, because the context behind that infamous quote actually matters a lot more than the soundbite alone suggests. Microsoft in 2001 wasn't just being dramatic for effect. The company was genuinely rattled. And I mean genuinely, at a boardroom level. By the way, the GPL, the general public license that a huge amount of open source software, including the Linux kernel, is released under, worked. The GPL has what's often called a viral or copyleft property. If you build something that incorporates GPL licensed code and you distribute it, in many cases, you're obligated to release your own code under the same open terms. For a company like Microsoft, whose entire business model at the time was built almost entirely on selling proprietary closed source software licenses, that wasn't just an inconvenience. It looked like an existential threat to the whole way they made money. So Ballmer's comment wasn't an isolated gaffe. It was one data point in a much longer, much more deliberate campaign. Microsoft ran things like the Get the Facts marketing initiative, which was specifically designed to compare Windows favorably against Linux in cost and reliability studies. Studies that, unsurprisingly, tended to be funded or commissioned in ways that favored Microsoft's conclusions. There were patent threats aimed at Linux vendors and the broader ecosystem, essentially warning companies that used Linux that they might be infringing on Microsoft's intellectual property, without ever fully specifying which patents or how. There were FUD campaigns, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, engineered to make enterprise IT departments nervous about adopting open source at scale. This was a real, sustained, multi-year effort by one of the most powerful companies in the world to slow down or stop the growth of Linux and open source software more broadly. And for a while it kind of worked, at least in certain markets. Enterprise adoption of Linux on the desktop stayed a niche, a hobbyist thing for a long time, even as it quietly took over server rooms and it became the backbone of the modern internet, the operating system. Running the vast majority of web servers, the majority of supercomputers on the planet, and eventually, though almost nobody outside the industry realized it at the time, most of the internet's largest cloud platforms, including, eventually, large parts of Microsoft's own Azure. There's a genuine irony worth sitting with there for a second. Even while Microsoft's public messaging in the early 2000s was hostile toward Linux, the broader technology industry around them was already quietly building its future on top of it. Fighting that tide publicly, while privately needing to reckon no with it internally, is part of what makes the next chapter of this story make so much sense. Then, something started to shift, and it happened faster and more thoroughly than almost anyone expected. By 2014, under a new CEO, Satya Nadella, Microsoft's public tone did a complete, almost jarring 180. Microsoft Loves Linux became the new official company line, repeated in keynote after keynote, blog post after blog post. And I want to be clear here, this pivot wasn't just a marketing slogan slapped onto an otherwise unchanged company. This has actually been a running decade-plus long theme now, with real, substantial technical follow-through behind it. Think about the pieces that got put in place along the way. SQL Server, one of Microsoft's flagship enterprise products, started shipping with native support to run on Linux, something that would have been almost unthinkable a decade earlier. Microsoft acquired GitHub, the single largest home for open source code collaboration on the planet, and, importantly, what didn't gut it or lock it down the way a lot of skeptics predicted at the time. They kept investing in it. Then there's the Windows subsystem for Linux, WSL, which let Windows users run an actual Linux environment directly inside Windows, and which Microsoft has continued to develop and expand for years, including recent additions like WSL containers. So when you zoom out and look at the full timeline, what just happened with Azure Linux isn't really a shocking, out-of-nowhere reversal. It's the natural next step in a pattern that's been building, brick by brick, for well over a decade. That doesn't mean it isn't newsworthy. It absolutely is, but it means we should understand it as a continuation of a strategy, not a spontaneous change of heart. It's also worth putting some scale behind that shift, because Microsoft's involvement in open source today is honestly staggering when you compare it to where the company started. Microsoft has, for a number of years now, ranked among the single largest corporate contributors to open source projects on GitHub, by commit volume and by the sheer number of employees actively contributing to public repositories. This is a company that now employs thousands of engineers whose day jobs involve writing and maintaining open source code in public under open licenses. If you told someone in the audience for that original cancer remark back in 2001 that this is where the company would end up 2.5 decades later, they'd have assumed you were describing a completely different company altogether, and that's really the tension sitting at the heart of this whole story. On one hand, this is a legitimate, substantial, multi-decade transformation, not some superficial rebrand or a single clever marketing campaign. On the other hand, transformation in service of what goal is really the question we should always be asking about a company this large and this powerful. Just because a shift is real doesn't automatically mean it's altruistic. And just because it isn't purely altruistic doesn't mean it isn't also genuinely useful to the people who end up using it. Both things can be true at once, and I think that's exactly the lens we need to hold on to as we get into the specifics of what actually shipped. Now let's actually talk about what Microsoft shipped, because the specific technical details here matter a lot, and most of the coverage I've seen glosses right over them. This is Azure Linux 4, and if that name doesn't ring a bell, that's because it used to be called something else, CBL Mariner. Microsoft has been quietly developing and using this distribution internally for years before most people outside the company ever heard its name. As of this new version 4.0 release, it's Fedora derived, which is actually a meaningful change from earlier versions, which were based on a different lineage. Earlier iterations pulled more from VMware's Photon OS rather than Fedora. That's not a trivial detail if you're someone who cares about package compatibility, tooling, and how a distribution behaves day to day. It's fully open source, and the entire project is hosted publicly on GitHub, which means anyone can go look at the code, the build process, the issue tracker, all of it. There's no black box here in terms of the source code itself. And here's the part that I think is genuinely the most interesting piece of this whole story, and the part most people don't realize. This distribution has been running Microsoft's own internal infrastructure and powering Azure services for years already. It wasn't built as a public relations stunt or a one-off open source gesture. It was built because Microsoft needed a lightweight, secure, purpose-built Linux distribution to run their own cloud at scale, and they built it quietly, used it internally, refined it over multiple iterations, and only now, after years of internal battle testing, are they handing the keys to the public. In terms of the actual timeline here, Azure Linux 4.0 was officially announced publicly at the Open Source Summit North America back in May of 2026. It then moved into public preview at Microsoft's own flagship developer conference, Build 2026, which ran the first few days of June. And then, just this past month, Microsoft went a step further and posted ISO installer files directly to the project's GitHub repository, which is a meaningful move because it means, for the first time, you don't need an active Azure subscription or cloud environment to actually try this thing out. You can download it, install it locally, in a lab, on a spare machine, in a virtual machine, on your own hardware, just to poke around and see what it's like. If you go looking for these ISO files yourself, a heads up, they're not sitting in the obvious GitHub Releases tab the way you might expect, which mostly just contains kernel builds. Instead, you need to scroll further down the project's page to a section labeled Using Azure Linux, and then expand a subsection called ISO Installer to actually find the downloadable images. Both x86 64 and ARM64 builds are available, which is worth noting for anyone running newer ARM-based hardware. One more piece worth mentioning here, because it's easy to confuse. There's a sibling product called Azure Container Linux. It shares the same underlying kernel and the same security update schedule as Azure Linux 4, but it's built to be immutable, meaning the core system files can't be modified after deployment, which is a security and reliability feature common in container-focused operating systems. These are two related but distinct products aimed at slightly different use cases. So if you're researching this yourself, don't accidentally conflate the two. It's also worth pausing on why the shift to a Fedora base specifically is a meaningful engineering decision, not just a footnote. Fedora is the community distribution most closely associated with Red Hat, and it tends to serve as something of a proving ground for technologies that later show up in Red Hat Enterprise Linux itself. By building version 4.0 on Fedora's package base, rather than continuing with the Photon OS lineage the earlier versions used, Microsoft is aligning Azure Linux more closely with the broader RPM-based Enterprise Linux world. The same world that Arhel, Alma Linux, and Rocky Linux all live in. For system administrators who already have deep experience with that ecosystem, tools, package managers, and configuration conventions, that alignment lowers the learning curve considerably compared to something built on a more unusual or isolated base. That detail also matters competitively. Rael has spent decades building trust in exactly the regulated, security-conscious environments we talked about a moment ago. Government agencies, banks, hospitals, defense contractors. By building something that RPM-literate administrators can pick up quickly, Microsoft isn't just building a product. It's building something that could plausibly compete for the same customers RAEL has spent a generation cultivating once the compliance gaps are closed. Now here's where I want to slow way down, because this is the part of the story that tends to get completely lost in the excitement of headlines like Microsoft ships free Linux distro. and I think it's actually the most important part for anyone who might be tempted to get their hopes up. This is not a desktop operating system. I want to say that as plainly as I possibly can. If any part of you is picturing this as some kind of free Windows replacement you could install on your home laptop tomorrow and use for everyday computing, browsing, office work, gaming, whatever, that is simply not what this product is. And it's not what it's designed to be. This is targeted squarely and specifically at cloud infrastructure. We're talking server workloads, Azure virtual machines, Azure Kubernetes, service clusters, VM scale sets, the back-end plumbing of enterprise cloud computing, not anything resembling a consumer desktop experience. It's also still in preview, which is an important distinction in software terms. Microsoft has not announced a general availability date, and they haven't finalized long-term support terms either. If you're the kind of person who remembers how many preview products from big tech companies either changed dramatically before their full release or in some cases quietly got shelved entirely, you'll understand why that caveat matters. There's also a genuinely significant compliance gap here that I think deserves real attention. FIPS 143 certification. That's a US government cryptographic standard that matters enormously for government agencies, financial services companies, and healthcare organizations, is still in progress for Azure Linux 4. It hasn't been completed yet. That's a hard blocker, not a minor inconvenience, for exactly the kinds of large, security-conscious organizations that might otherwise be excited about a free Microsoft-backed Linux option. For context, distributions like certified builds of Red Hat Enterprise Linux have already cleared that bar, which is a big part of why regulated industries have historically defaulted to RHEL rather than experimenting with something newer. On top of that, WSL support, meaning the ability to run Azure Linux specifically as a distro inside the Windows subsystem for Linux, is reportedly coming shortly, according to Microsoft's own messaging, but as of right now, it hasn't actually shipped yet either. So if you're an IT administrator or a systems engineer watching this video with genuine professional interest, absolutely. Go ahead and download the ISO, spin it up in a lab environment, kick the tires, get a feel for how it behaves compared to what you're used to. That's exactly what a preview release is for. But this is not today. A mature, fully certified, production-ready replacement for an established enterprise Linux distribution in a regulated environment. Anyone telling you otherwise right now is getting ahead of where Microsoft themselves say this product actually is. And it's worth remembering how these preview to production timelines have played out with Microsoft's other Linux adjacent projects historically, because the pattern gives us a reasonable basis for expectations here. The WSL itself spent years in a preview-like state before it matured into the polished, broadly trusted tool it is today, with multiple false starts and significant architecture changes along the way. If Azure Linux follows anything like that same trajectory, we could realistically be looking at another year or more before the certification gaps close, and this becomes something regulated industries can seriously consider deploying at scale. That's not a criticism. Building trustworthy infrastructure software properly takes time, but it's a useful gut check against any headline implying this is already a finished, ready-to-deploy product today. So let's pull back and ask the real question this video is actually about, because I don't think the interesting story here is really Microsoft made a Linux distro. I think the interesting story is, why now, and what does it actually get them? I'd argue this isn't fundamentally about generosity, and I don't think it's really about some kind of ideological conversion either, where Microsoft has genuinely become an open source company in spirit the way, say, Red Hat or Canonical are. I think this is much more straightforwardly about control of the infrastructure layer. Here's the underlying logic, as I see it. Enterprises are going to run massive amounts of Linux workloads on Azure, regardless of what Microsoft does. That ship has already sailed, and it sailed a long time ago. The overwhelming majority of workloads running in public clouds today, across every major provider, are Linux-based, not Windows-based. That's just the reality of modern cloud infrastructure. Given that reality, Microsoft is left with a choice. Either those Linux workloads keep running on Ubuntu, or Debian, or Rachel, or some other established distribution that Microsoft has no direct control over, or alternatively, Microsoft can build their own purpose-built Azure-optimized distribution, quietly perfect it over years of internal use, and then make it available so that more and more of that Linux workload gravitates towards something Microsoft actually controls end-to-end. Well, that's not a conspiracy theory. That's just sound, rational business strategy from Microsoft's perspective. If you're going to be running Linux on Azure no matter what, wouldn't Microsoft obviously prefer that you're running their Linux, tightly integrated with their tooling, their support channels, their update cadence, rather than someone else's? But here's why I think this fits a much bigger pattern that this channel has documented again and again across dozens of stories over the past year. Every single time Microsoft opens up something or makes a friendly open source flavored gesture, it tends to arrive with strings attached. Strings that, intentionally or not, tend to keep you more firmly inside the Microsoft ecosystem, rather than genuinely giving you more freedom to leave it. Think about the pattern we've covered before, because once you start looking for it, it shows up again and again. Dual boot systems running Linux alongside Windows have repeatedly broken after routine Windows updates, seemingly without much regard for how disruptive that is to users who deliberately chose to run both operating systems side by side on the same machine. Secure boot certificate transitions have caught Linux users off guard with very little public warning, threatening to break systems that were working perfectly fine the day before, simply because a certificate expiration date arrived on Microsoft's schedule rather than anyone else's. Microsoft Teams has quietly broken on Firefox, specifically for Linux users, in ways that conveniently don't affect Chrome or Edge, Microsoft's own browsers. Even the Windows subsystem for Linux itself, the very tool that's often held up as proof of Microsoft's Linux friendliness, has recently gained new administrative controls that let IT departments restrict through Intune whether employees are even allowed to use WSL or Linux containers on their work machines at all. That last example is particularly telling because it captures both halves of the pattern in a single feature release. Microsoft genuinely made WSL more powerful and more useful. Full container support, faster file. System performance through the new VirtIOS default, improved networking. Real, substantive engineering work that benefits developers. And in that same breath, they added the administrative tooling that lets an organization's IT department switch it all back off with a single policy setting. Openness and control shipped together in the same release notes. Over and over, we see this same underlying shape, compatibility or openness or interoperability dressed up as a gift to users, when the practical effect tends to keep people leaning on Microsoft's ecosystem rather than genuinely, cleanly letting them go their own way if they wanted to. So is Azure Linux actually Microsoft genuinely, finally joining the open source world on equal terms with everyone else? Or is it just Microsoft building a more comfortable, more modern looking cage? One where the bars are dressed up as a welcome mat? I don't think there's a single clean answer to that question, and honestly, I think that ambiguity is exactly the point. This is a company capable of doing both things at once, genuinely contributing meaningful, useful open source infrastructure to the world, while also very deliberately positioning that contribution to serve their own long-term strategic interests. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive, and I think pretending they are, either by dismissing this as pure marketing spin or by celebrating it as some kind of full ideological conversion, misses what's actually happening here. And it's worth stepping back one more time to place this inside the bigger cloud industry picture, because Microsoft isn't operating in a vacuum here. Amazon has AL 2023, its own Amazon Linux distribution purpose-built for AWS. Google has container-optimized OS for GKE workloads. Every major cloud provider, at this point, has recognized the same underlying incentive. If your customers are going to run Linux on your infrastructure regardless, you want at least some meaningful share of that running on a distribution you control, tune, and can optimize specifically for your own hardware and services. Viewed that way, Azure Linux isn't Microsoft doing something unprecedented or uniquely calculating. It's Microsoft finally catching up to a strategy its biggest cloud competitors already adopted years earlier. That doesn't make it a bad move. It just means the openness framing and a lot of the coverage around this story tends to undersell how competitively normal this actually is. That context also helps explain the timing. This isn't landing in a vacuum either. It's landing at a moment when governments across Europe are actively reconsidering their reliance on any single American cloud or software vendor, Microsoft very much included, for reasons of cost and digital sovereignty. A more open, more inspectable, Fedora-based Linux offering gives Microsoft a stronger answer to exactly that kind of scrutiny than a purely closed-source Windows Server story would. Whether that's a coincidence of timing or a deliberate piece of positioning, I'll leave for you to decide. But it's hard to look at Azure Linux's public debut this year in complete isolation from everything else going on around Microsoft's cloud business right now. Let me give you the short version to close this out. Azure Linux 4 is free, it's public, it's genuinely open source, hosted transparently on GitHub for anyone to inspect. It's Fedora-based as of this version, which is a real technical shift from its earlier lineage, and it's been quietly running Microsoft's own cloud infrastructure for years before the public ever got a look at it. But it's still preview only. It's targeted squarely at cloud and server workloads, not desktop computing. It's missing FIPS 143 certification, which is a hard blocker for a lot of the most security-conscious organizations that might otherwise be interested. And WSL support, general availability, and finalized long-term support terms are all still somewhere down the road. Not here yet. I genuinely want to know what you think about this one, because I think it's a story that splits people. Would you trust Microsoft's own homegrown Linux distribution over something like Ubuntu, Fedora, or Debian, distributions built and governed independently of any single corporate parent? Or does the fact that this comes from Microsoft specifically make you more cautious, given everything we've documented on this channel about how their ecosystem tends to work? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one of them, and some of the best follow-up stories on this channel have come directly out of conversations that started right there in the comment section. If you're new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of story we dig into regularly. The space where Microsoft, Linux, and the broader open source world collide, sometimes cooperatively and sometimes not so much. We'll be keeping an eye on this one specifically as it moves from preview toward general availability, especially once that FIPS certification question gets resolved one way or another, because that's really the moment this stops being a story about intentions and starts being a story about actual adoption numbers. So if that's the kind of thing you want more of, go ahead and subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, and I will see you in the next video.